Are there any frameworks that can help us to improve the way we make decisions?
The framework is the rational decision making process. And that's basically about 5 stages, right? So the first one is really clearly define the problem. And then the second step is evaluation of alternatives. It's really good to think about what the different options are. There's always a third way. The other ones is basically.
Hello and welcome to Polyweb. I'm your host, Sara Landi Tortoli, and my guest today is Professor Dr. Cohen Pauwels, Professor of Marketing at Northeastern University, MBI Oslo, Principal Research Scientist at Amazon, and expert in decision making. With Professor Pauwels, we talk about how to make better decisions and frameworks to help you improve your personal and business decision making, including what product should you build and what are the right KPIs to focus on. I personally took a lot of notes during this conversation, so I hope you will enjoy it as much as I did. Colin, you are an expert in decision making. And what I would like to do in this conversation is to go through some scenarios and analyze the concept of optimal decision making in several scenarios, if you're willing. It's a little game that we're playing.
It should be fun.
But before we start with scenario number one, I want to just first get an understanding of what are the bases in general for a good decision making, and perhaps even more important or as important is are there any frameworks that can help us to improve the way we make decisions?
that's a that's a great question. I mean, I would say a good decision is the one that you can live with afterwards, and I think that's a very kind of
Ooh.
outcome oriented one. And I'll give you a fun example that's from a colleague of me at Stanford. So he always talks about the process of making decisions, and that's very important that you agree on that one, and then kind of ultimately whether the decision was successful or not, right? Depends on so many factors. But you have to be comfortable with the process. The example that he gives, which is very typical to his culture, is that so he was at Stanford in the US and he's originally from India. And so right before his 30th birthday, he calls up his mom in India and says, "Hey, I want to marry before I'm 30, of course. So can you find me a suitable lady to marry in India?" And she's like, "Yeah, but you have to adhere to the process. You have to promise me." And he's like, "Yes, okay. What are your conditions?" And she says, "Well, I'll find you 3 ladies, but you have to promise that you'll go on a date with every single one of them. So you can't say after the first one, 'Oh, I'm in love with her.' No, you have to go on all the 3 dates, and then you also have to promise that you select one of them before a certain time." And he's like, "Fine, I'll do that." And then so she does have the 3 ladies and the dates lined up for him. The first one, it doesn't click so much. The second one, he's like, "Oh, this is fantastic. This is the woman of my life. I'm gonna marry her. I don't want to go on the third date with the other lady." And the woman is, and then his mother is like, "No, you have to go." So he goes to the third date, and then he ultimately marries the person from the second date, and they have been happily married, I think, for 30 or 40 years now. So he put it in a presentation about basically agreeing, whether it's yourself or with your family or with your company on a certain process for decision making, and that's really important to avoid bad decisions and make good decisions.
So, aside from everyone getting matchmaker,
Yeah.
how
Mm.
can we lay those ground rules that can help us with decision makings? First of all,
Yeah.
like how do I even start? To understand what those ground rules should be.
Okay. Well, I mean, the framework that I've been taught in my undergraduate, right, which lots of people grow up with, which I think is still very useful, is the rational decision making process. So
Okay.
how should you approach a decision? And there has been a lot written about it in, probably the last 2,000 years or so. And that's basically about 5 stages, right? So the first one is really clearly define the problem. And so if you talk to kind of a really good listener, or maybe sometimes a consultant or somebody that you ask for advice, they're going to push you on really identifying what the problem is. So because what you think you have to make a decision out, that may just be a symptom, right? That may just be kind of a symptom of an underlying disease if you're a doctor and you diagnose something of a problem. And so it's just really important to understand what is the exact problem that you're facing. And then the second step is evaluation of alternatives. And so that is typically the one that I help people, I think, almost the most with. So you are, yeah, like, stuck in your own situation. You may know a lot about your business, for instance, or about your situation, but you may not always be the best person in saying what are the options, what are the alternatives, what are some of the things I can do. And so and so it's really good to think about what the different options are. And if people put you for say yes or no to two things, there's always a third way, right? That's what my kids said too. If I put them for an ultimatum, so there's always kind of something else that sometimes gets you out of a hard pickle, in terms of that you thought you only had two real options, and that you could have a different alternative. And so it's really important then to get as much information as you can about these alternatives. And so I would say this phase is typically a bit more dispassionate. It should be very rational in terms of saying, well, what is really out there. And then as you're getting the information, you come to the evaluation. And there I would always see that your feelings play a very important role, right? So as you're getting more information about these options, you will feel in your heart or in your guts, depending on how you put it, which one seems like the better kind of point for you. Some people, some kind of quantitative nerds like me, like to do this formally. So I have the spreadsheet that I put pluses and minuses, and I use that for, like, where I got my first job, pluses and minuses in other decisions, also kind of which quarters I work with. But then ultimately, it's important to kind of take this with a grain of salt, because you ultimately go where your heart tells you to go, but it's hopefully informed by the information you get.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
yeah, yeah.
Wait, I have like
Go ahead. Yeah,
millions of questions already.
yeah.
But sorry for the interruption. Maybe there were more steps. I don't want to skip any.
No, the other ones is basically that you actually have to make the decision. And so some people forget that. And so I would see, as a manager, right, or as a startup founder, or as a leader, your first task is to actually make the decision. And so sometimes that's forgotten, right? I mean, in some companies, they say that the worst decision is no decision, and I agree with that. So a lot of times, kind of, you don't wait for all the perfect information. You actually have to make the decision, communicate it to the people that get involved and affected by the decision, and then of course you have to implement it, and you have to evaluate to learn from the implementation and from your decision whether it was the right one. So after you make the decision, kind of, be strong about it, transparent about it, and then also implement it, and follow up on finding out whether it was a good thing or not.
Okay. So I have I think we can do
Go ahead.
two part of this podcast because I have a lot of questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, first of all, when you say you should know what the alternatives are, but as you correctly mentioned, when you are really that deeply in a situation, a certain situation, it's very difficult to spot that there is a third way and a fourth way, maybe, and so forth. So, what are ways in which we could see different alternatives? We could discover them.
So I would say pre-internet talked to a lot of people, and so I always love to learn from the mistakes of others. And it is also a reason why your podcast is so great, by the way, Sarah. So it's always nice to hear other people's stories and things they really have enjoyed doing, and decisions they were really happy about later on, and then decisions that they have regretted making. So I think that's a great idea. And there's there's resources you can check out now online, right? I think generative AI is getting sometimes a bad rap, but for me it's a really good tool to kind of get some options out there. I mean, to give you one example, so I told in the introduction I did my PhD in UCLA, but I actually started in my native Belgium. And I didn't even know that you could do a PhD in marketing in the States, and that it was a good idea. I just hadn't been exposed to people that thought about that way. And so I went to a conference, and one of the professors that gave me feedback was a Belgian professor in UCLA. And I was like, well, among the three, he gave the most relevant feedback. And so then I started looking it up, and I'm like, oh, you can do a PhD in the US, and these are some of the benefits. And so I start getting interested. So it's very often you learn about things by the people you talk to, which sometimes is incidental, but you can work to expose yourself to more points of view, whether offline or online. It's now much easier, right, to join discussion groups or join kind of people that come from another bubble than your own.
Yeah, I mean that's fantastic. Um, like one way I do it for myself, but I do it like for personal stuff. I
Mm.
think it's like, do you know Byron Katie, the work?
No.
So
Oh,
basically,
that's
she
cool.
has like when some unhelpful thoughts come your way, she has a process for you to deal with it. And the first question that she asks is it true? And then the second one is, are you absolutely sure that this is true? And then, like, there is one more step that I need to Google because I don't remember it. But the final step is what she calls the turnaround. And basically, you need to turn the problem upside down. So you phrase it you phrase it differently. Like, for example, I don't know, my brother is mean to me, right? That could be the problem, and I could say, my brother should be mean to me. I should be mean to my brother, like, and then you start, slowly you turn things around until you arrive to a new perspective, basically. So it reminds me a little bit of that,
Yeah.
kind of.
I think that is really useful. I think also, I mean, one of the frameworks that I like myself from psychology is regulatory focus, and that basically has to do with whether you're mostly, and they call that promotion focus versus prevention focused, and that is whether you see life as opportunities or threats. And I find that very helpful to understand my own thinking and reverse it. So promotion focus, it's also called the growth mindset by some
Mhm.
people. It's basically that you see life and decisions mostly as opportunities that you either take or that you miss. And
Yeah.
so, and people, from your childhood, you have a natural tendency. And so I'm relatively extreme on that side. So I see life as opportunities that you either take or you miss. And so I tend not to think about the risks, for instance. Other people have much more a prevention focus. That means that you see life as threats and disasters that you either avoid or that happen to you. And so I've learned, for instance, with the pandemic, that I'm a bit too much on this promotion focused and that I should think more about, risks and things that can go wrong. That's what I'm doing. And an extremely helpful thing for me is always if I make a decision about a future commitment, which happens quite often, right? I have to decide whether I'm going to be on this podcast. You have to decide whether you go on a business trip in a month, and so forth. I always try to imagine myself as my future self right before having to do it. So instead of thinking, oh, it's a Friday afternoon and somebody invites me on some business trip, I'm like, okay, and I see the potential and how fantastic it would be. But a month from now, I imagine myself on that Monday morning having to go on the plane. and having to forgo other things that I could be doing and so forth. And so that imagining your future self is, for instance, helpful for me to think more about the obstacles, the practicalities, and things that I typically don't look at. And so other people that are much more prevention focused, what I do with them is to think much more about the potential and the long term. So, for instance, you don't, you're right before going to a party, which would be nice for your social life, but you're like, well, I don't feel too well, I don't think that my clothes are right, and so forth. But then, in the long term, every year, you're like, I don't go out enough, and I miss the socialization. So people who are much more prevention focused, I typically focus on, hey, overall in the long term, what kind of person you want to be, and then they start thinking a bit more about opportunity. So that's something that very practically helped me.
Uh-huh. Interesting. How do you go about gathering information to make your decisions? Because you mentioned you have like you're more the analytical type, so you do
Yeah.
like spreadsheets and stuff like that. Which, by the way, I'm a huge nerd. Like I do that as well.
Mhm.
Like I remember when I wanted to understand which was the best hosting website provider. I made
Here
like
we
a
go.
spreadsheet, and had like every single little voice, and then like check marks for each.
Yeah.
Okay, this isn't that. But like, I'm curious, what's your process like?
So I mean, in this rational decision making process, right? And as I said, I think it's very helpful. You think about what are your criteria, what are the dimensions that are important for you in this decision, and then you think about how to weigh those criteria. And then, of course, for every alternative, you have your score on that one, right? So a very formal way, it's called the multi-attribute framework, and that basically just you multiply your criteria with their weight, and then the score for each alternative, and you come up with the total score. It's a very kind of quick way to do it. Now, what is so important in that one is first of all figuring out what are your criteria. And for me, it's important to recognize that these criteria and their weights may change as you're going through the process. So the example that I give when I was on the job market, right? So I was, invited by about I think 17 universities at the time, and I had my starting criteria about what would be great. But as they were flying me out to visit their places, I came up with new ones. And so
Mm.
because I would see things there that I either liked or didn't like, and then so I would say be flexible to add to things. And then the same thing for the weighting of the criteria, right? So you may think that, oh, this is all about one dimension about X, but then you realize over time that Y and Z are also important. So I think that's important. And then about the alternatives, talk to people who have lived them. I would say so. Our oldest son now went through the whole college application process in the U.S. And we never got better information than talking to current students and past students of that place, and also parents of these universities, because they can tell you stuff that is not in the brochure, and that that you took for granted because all of the alternatives you've lived through had something in common, but then that other place had some negative that you never even considered that you would have to account for. So yeah, in terms of the score, the score should be very kind of, I would say the scores, I try them to be more objective based on what I hear from people, but the decision criteria are your own. So don't, allow yourself to be swayed by other people's weights. It's your personal decision, right? Or your company's, future. But then in this, how you score the alternatives, I would really try to be as objective as possible there.
Yeah, I mean, objectivity is difficult, especially if it's a decision that involves you, etc.
Yeah,
But like you mentioned, like for example, shall I get this job or not? Right?
yeah,
So how did you make the decision for yourself? Like for example, accepting the job that you had at the
uh,
Amazon, or like being a
yeah.
professor and moving in the US. How did you went about all those personal choices? Like thinking about it.
So to some extent, yes, in the sense that kind of both going to the US and taking the jobs, it was something I felt I just had to do at the time. So even though I got lots of information about it, it's important to realize that you have your wants and desires and kind of and pet peeves at one time. I'm very much a believer in this kind of I think it was Nietzsche called it Wille zur Macht, in the sense that you have certain wants and you should go after them. And then, of
Mm,
course, once you take the job, after 5, 6 months, you decide it's not for you, right? Or you start up a company and it was not what you turned out to be. The audience that wants to pay for it is very different, so you have to pivot and so forth. And that is perfectly fine. And very often, also, when we get what we wanted or thought we wanted, we realize that's not the one thing that makes us happy, right? So I think it's important when you make the decision that yeah, it's really what you want at the time, but to also then realize that things may change.
yeah. Yeah. I remember I spent a lot of time really thinking about decision making, like a lot, because in my job as a product manager,
Yeah,
like my job was essentially making decisions,
yeah,
prioritizing, making decisions, say, okay, we're going to focus on this versus that, you know?
yeah,
And for everything that I said yes to, there were at least 10, 20, 30 that I implicitly or explicitly say
yeah,
no to. So I really spent a lot of time like thinking about decision making. And I remember like reading this, I think it was a shareholder letter from Jeff
yeah,
Bezos that talks about type 1 and type
and two, yeah,
2 of decision making. I might get them mixed up, but one of them is basically that it calls them reversible decision making
yeah,
that are very easy to go back from. And then there is the type 2, if I'm not getting them mixed up,
yeah,
that instead are very difficult to reverse. Right. So, how should one think about that? And also in relation to the time it takes to make a
yeah,
decision.
yeah. That's an excellent question, and so we live this kind of one-way and two-way doors every day at Amazon, and so in two-way doors, right? So that you can easily go back. The point is always that you have to make a decision fast. And so, yes, it should be based on information, but the important thing is that you make a decision. And if you're in a bigger company, I think it's absolutely crucial to delegate it to the lowest level of the hierarchy that has enough information to make the decision. So these are the kind of things that you should really allow your people to make. And then you can monitor and evaluate, but they shouldn't spend too much time making the decision, and it should be made at that level of the organization. The one way doors, they're going to be very costly to reverse, and there you want to have a lot more, meetings and documents. A very cool way. So Amazon really has a document writing and reading culture. So when we have like an hour meeting, we start half an hour by reading the doc. And what I really like about the docs, it's like 3 or 4 pages typically, but then the last part is always frequently asked questions. So the person who's proposing a decision has anticipated and should anticipate what objections will be raised, what practicalities people will have to know, which things will have to get up. And so, and very often the one that I add to it is, what has to happen for this to succeed, right? So that we think through that one. But so that is absolutely key to each. And so for these, harder to reverse decisions, we do have a lot more meetings and a lot more iterations of that doc than for the easily reversible decisions.
What's the process like then for more complex decisions at Amazon? So when you say much more meetings, etc., like how does it look like? And at which point do you draw a line in the sand and say, okay, we need to make the decision now?
Well. So the first page is always the press release. So it's called PRFAQ, press release and frequently asked questions, because we want to work backwards. We want to start from what we want to offer the customer, right? And so forcing the person to write the anticipated press release tells you two things. Number one, they have to put a date there. So suppose that I propose something and I say, hey, April 12th, 2024. So that basically kind of gives an idea about what the timeline is supposed to be, right? And then maybe external deadlines, but this is very cool for that one. And then you basically write, how this would look like as a press communique, kind of, what is the customer benefit or what is the customer problem that you're solving? Some quotes, right? Some simulated quotes from customers who are like, hey, I'm this type of customers and I'm really helped by this for this and this reason, which also identifies the target audience for the solution. And so it's really working backwards, kind of this is what we ultimately want to achieve, and then which steps do we have to take, and at which time do they have to happen, right? So at a kind of
Mm,
critical path thinking on timing, which teams have to be involved to do that, and then kind of have we invited the right people to the meetings. You don't want the meeting to be that too large, and we already
yeah.
have, everybody has too many meetings, but you do want to have the key stakeholders or representatives in there.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's stay with the company
Yeah,
example and talk about collective decision making.
yeah,
So, and we talk about making going through different scenarios, right?
yeah.
So let's assume that this is scenario number one,
Mhm.
and we are in a company that is in a growth stage or is already established, like Amazon,
Yeah,
right? How do you make decisions regarding topics such as innovation? So, for example, establishing a new product line or entering a new market, adopting a new technology. Like, for example, how should we leverage AI and
yeah.
ChatGPT in the company? Or should we, you know?
Yeah. I mean, it's all kind of, it goes back to your leading principles, right? So one of Amazon is think big. So we always encourage employees to kind of think really big. But of course, then you get things like last year, one of the ideas was to do with the metaverse, and probably this year, AI is going to be more. So you kind of aim through the process to think about some patterns in innovation, right? So we all know innovation is risky, so it's something that you should approach as such, instead of kind of anticipating a guaranteed result. We also know that it takes up resources that could be spent somewhere else. So as a company, you're always thinking, well, is this something that needs to be done? Is there a real need for it? And then are we in a really good position to do it? And I mean, one of the things I picked up from my strategy colleagues, right? I was always against this whole sustainable competitive advantage idea because I think you can never sustain anything. The competition is so good. So instead, I like the idea of basically running faster than your competition, right? So anything that any company does, eventually in time you can replicate with your company, specifically with the newest tools. But by the time you have done so, the original company has dig much deeper in it already. So yes, your company is particularly good at some things and not good at others. I typically give the example of, for instance, 3M versus Dell. So 3M is this company that is fantastic in developing new stuff and is also pretty good at commercializing them. And with all due respect, absolutely sucks at running an existing business. So one of their key metrics is how much revenue are we getting from products that we have developed in the last 5 years. Why is that such a good metric for them? Is because that's where all their profit comes from. So once cheap competition comes in, they're not very good with their pricing and continuing there. On the other hand, Dell Computers is, in my eyes, not a very innovative company, right? They thrive in an industry where everybody understands what the products are, and they aim to do it more efficient. So before the internet, Dell had this business that they would only take people who knew how to buy computers. This was the early 90s, and so they didn't need as much hand holding as other kind of audiences, and they bought computers that were already out there, and Dell would just make it more efficient, first by telephone to buy it, then of course with the internet and so forth. So for Dell, the metric of how much are we selling from things developed in the last 5 years wouldn't make much sense. So your company tends to be naturally better at some innovations and at innovating versus maintaining an existing business. And I think kind of these two things are absolutely crucial. So look at, is there a strong customer need? Is that the customer we want to serve? and can profitably serve in the long term? Does my company and my culture and my employees, are they particularly good at this, or can they become very good, and can they maintain it by getting better and better at it? And then of course also, like, who are your real competitors in the space, right? So not just the product category, but which companies address the same need. So if you're making an entertainment product, you're competing with all of the other entertainment products out there, even though they're not called video games or entertainment parks and so forth.
Mm, okay. And you mentioned something related to KPIs. One of the ways that we can understand if it was a good decision or not,
Mm.
it's by picking the right way to observe it,
Yeah,
right? And in a company context, this usually means picking metrics and
yeah,
KPIs. So, and I know that you've written about it also in your book, but also an article from it that
yeah.
was very insightful. So maybe I wonder if you could share how should a company, a product manager, a founder, whatever, go about picking the right metrics to observe.
So yeah, I'm by training, I'm an engineer, so I look at everything as input, throughput, output, and then so your input are your actions. The output is what you ultimately want, right? That could be sales, profits, or if you're not for profit, things like donations and so forth. And then so in the KPIs in the middle, the throughput. I mean, I in my research and examples in consultancy, two main criteria came up, right? So if anybody is proposing you KPI, the question is, well, does it ultimately translate into my output, into what I really want? And the second question is, can I influence it with my action? So can I easily see that what I do or what my people can do influences it, right? So I see a lot of company dashboards that are full with metrics that either the employee can't influence, right? And then it's very disheartening because you can change it, or ultimately do not fit with performance. And so the latter part we called vanity metrics, right? So I give you a typical example. So the first car company I did consultancy for in the US, I then later moved to Istanbul in Turkey, and so they wanted me to do something there, and I was just down the street from my university. It was really nice. And this is 2008, and at that moment I think Turkey was the third biggest Facebook nation in the world. So after the US and the UK, Turkey had the third highest number of Facebook accounts, and it was just a very popular kind of social media platform. And so this car company had about the same market share in Turkey as in the US, I think about 2%. And so they were really keen on following academics' advice. Academics had been saying to companies all the time, hey, so many of your customers are online. Why aren't you putting more of your marketing resources there? And they did. So in 2008, they spent 50% of their whole budget online. And they were very proud on Facebook to have the number one automobile Facebook site in Turkey. And so even though they only had 2% market share, and they were so happy with that, and they spent lots of time interacting with people there. But unfortunately, they didn't see any increase in sales. So that's a bit of a problem. And so I was like, well, but you know your business better than I do, right? So what do you absolutely need to get to increase your market share, right? And to get people to drive your fantastic new cars. And they said, that's so easy. It's test drives. So we need to get people in a test drive. And so I got some of their past data, and we analyzed it, and we saw that none of their Facebook interactions and engagement drove test drives. And I'm like, well, that's a problem. And so what they did had an impact on Facebook interactions, so that's great. But the Facebook interactions did not, go downstream in terms of test drives and sales. And then you go deeper, right? And then you say, well, is the audience the wrong one? Are these just, teenagers or early 20 somethings who don't have the money to buy your cars? Or, is the kind of things that people are talking about unlikely to get a call to action to actually do the test drive? But so that's one of the things that I say. So whenever you have a metric, can you or somebody that is seeing the metric influence it? Does it have responsiveness to your marketing action? And then does it have what I call sales conversion? Does it ultimately convert to what you ultimately want?
This is also a topic that I spend quite a bit of time thinking because observing how your product is doing requires you to really focus on metric and really pick the one that I think can really move the needle and not focusing on what we call the vanity metrics.
Yeah,
Right. And there are all sorts of framework that product manager use to get around that.
yeah,
But most of the listeners of this podcast actually do work a startup or have a startup. And as such, in a startup, you really have to make a lot of decisions, small and big, because your survivor basically, like, literally depends on it. And it's really fast to see the impact. Like, example of decisions that you have to make as a startup is like positioning, getting founded, how you're going to build your customer funnel, your marketing strategy. And the thing that I struggled the most working at a startup was actually optimizing resources. So,
oh
given
yeah,
the amount of money that we have and the people that we have, and we have like a list of stuff that we could potentially do that is long,
yeah,
you know, that is so long.
yeah,
How do I optimize resources and make the one thing that really drive the needle
yeah,
forward, basically? So, and you can pick whatever direction you would like to go with
yeah.
this, but I wonder, how would you go about approaching those challenges?
Well, so I have written about the lean startup methodology, which I really like, and this was in the context of big data, and that we saw it, complicating versus making decision making easier. And so what I like about the lean startup methodology is that you think about the major things that you have to achieve, and then within a certain time, right? Because if you get early success and more resources, then you can do more things. But you test out hypotheses. You make your hypothesis explicit and you test them out. And the stereotypical example is how Zappos got started, right? So the big question is, hey, our assumption is that people are willing to buy shoes online. So how do you test that out? Before you have the whole production and inventory things, the guy basically, made the website and made shoes in a nice presentable way, and then he had actually people buying it, and then he would go to his competition to buy the shoe because he didn't have the shoes yet. So he said, look, the production and the inventor of the shoes yourself, that comes later. I first want to make sure that I can make a website that people are comfortable buying shoes from. And so think about the things that kind of need to happen first. I think that's really important. I mean, I'll give you an example. So in the late 90s, I was in LA, the first internet boom, and I was only 26. I was much younger, but people already then thought me, I was pretty skeptical about technology, that I was too old, because there was this presentation, and this was 1998, about a company developing a mouse that would give off smell and touch, because they said, look, on the internet you can buy audio stuff and visual stuff, but if you buy like a beautiful dress, you can go over it with your fingers to feel the fabric. If you buy a perfume, you can smell it. So they were making this mouse and spending millions and millions of dollars of VC money, right? To kind of, if you would go over fabric, you would feel it in your fingers. If it perfume, it would give off the smell. And so I was the only one laughing out loud in the room. And I'm like, no, consumers will not want a mouse that gives off a smell. And they're like, well, you don't know anything. You're too old. The new generation gets it. And it's now 25 years later. But kind of the whole kind of assumption that this would be something that people would even want to have, I thought was really funny. Because there's a lot of fundamentals of human behavior and our holdups that are, only very slowly change, that you can, if you really want to do something that nobody else has done before, you really have to look at kind of how do people have to change their behavior, and then you can test out whether they're willing to do that or not.
Yeah. I mean, experimentation is huge, but to be honest with you, I'm gonna say something that it's gonna sound
Mm.
really unpopular right now.
Uh-huh.
But I think experimentation, especially as a startup,
Yeah.
is overestimated. In the sense,
Okay.
I'm not saying that you should not experiment. You should, but experiments are, number one, usually costly,
Yeah.
and number two, they take time.
Yeah.
Because, to run an experiment, you need to have some sort of meaningful data to work with, etc.
Yeah.
So they do take time. And therefore, like in the context of a startup, it's sometimes very, very difficult. And also, like, they take maybe engineering time that could instead be allocated to do something else. And maybe you have
Yeah,
like 5 engineers in total, you know. So even if it takes, you know, 2 people time, it's still time spent doing something, you know,
yeah,
that is an experiment that might work or might not work. So I found it to be honest for myself to be a
interesting. Yeah.
challenge, you know.
Well, and yeah, I mean, you also have your strategy and your vision, right? Which is really
Yeah.
important. So some things you can say. I like to kind of, before you do the study, you probably really have done your homework in terms of, what it should be and what is your strategy and vision. And so experiments are really great for, I would say, tactical decisions. Kind of which
Yeah.
exact message do you put on this display ad? For that, experiments are pretty kind of efficient. But yes, you need to have the strategy and the vision to kind of shortcut some of that process. So with the professor in organizational behavior, I just published a book called Break the Wall, why and how you should democratize digital in your business. And we have almost no experiments there. It's like, hey, here is an interesting framework that you can apply to your business. Here is how you can see some gaps, and then here is how you fill the gaps. One of the interesting parts there is, for instance, if you have a new technology, should you hire new people or should you train your existing ones? I think startups will like that too, because we make a big arguments for retraining your existing employees, because they have, they know the business, they know your values and the company's values. And bringing in somebody very highly paid, that takes time to get them kind of whole culturated in the whole process. So there's some of the decisions that make there. And yeah, in that book we have very few experiments to talk about, indeed.
Ah, and how do you go about that decision? Like, let's stay with that. Like, what did you say in the book about should you retrain your workforce or
Yeah,
should you hire new people? In the end, what's less costly?
yeah. So in a lot of times we see that companies, over-index on hiring new people, and so the big benefits we see in employees is that so that professor, her name is Zainab Ekshahili, her dissertation was about norm transform in remote settings. And this was also the end of the 90s, so she was really ahead of her time. And so she has really studied how important the norms and the culture are, right? I mean, some people say always, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it takes a while to kind of get people to buy in and internalize the norms of your company. and
Mm.
so and so once they have done that, and you hired some relatively smart and adaptable people, it really pays off to trust them, and to have them learn new things, instead of replacing them with somebody who claims that they know something or of a different pedigree. So there's a lot of things to be said for kind of staying with your core employees, and retraining them when needed, instead of just hiring from the outside.
Okay. Ah, interesting. I want to run with you one more
Yeah,
scenario. So we talk about decision making for personal decisions.
yeah,
We talk about decision making bigger company like Amazon. We talk about decision making for a startup, but how do we make decision as a society? Like,
oh wow,
so,
yeah,
and I explained to you the background of these
yeah,
questions because it feels like, technologically speaking, and in this podcast we talk about a lot uh, about
mm,
the latest technological innovation. And to me, it feels like we are at a crossroads of technological breakthrough in many different industries. Like AI is one,
yeah,
but like I can think about biotech and genomics as well. Talking about the studies that are being conducted to reverse aging, let's
yeah,
say, right? But certainly some that everyone is familiar with is AI, right?
yeah,
And this quest to build AGI, so artificial general
yeah,
intelligence. So, how, as a society, should we go about making very complex decision making that affect all of us,
yeah,
right? So, for example, um, I'm sure you've seen this letter signed, by Elon Musk, Yuval Noah Harari, etc., that called um, for a stop, basically,
Yeah,
in the AI advancement, because
yeah,
we should put some guardrails and some ground rules to the development.
yeah.
So, how should we think about those challenges?
So this comes very much in the realm of ethical decision making frameworks, right? And so I used to, teach a session about that. That talk, and so you have the utilitarian perspective, the greatest good for the greatest amount of people. You have the perspectives that said, no, we should basically take best care of the people who need our protection most in society, and so these are very important considerations to be made. I think I want to do. I really believe in democracy, so I believe in kind of presenting these frameworks to people. I'll give you a quick thing, right? So every time I'm paying taxes, I'm still upset. And in the US, it takes like half a day or a day. It's ridiculous how long it takes. And I'm still upset that there's no survey that says, hey, how do you want your taxes to be spent? I mean, it doesn't. It can be a non-binding thing, but wouldn't it be interesting if you have millions of taxpayers to have some idea about how much they want to spend on the military or on investment in technology or on and fixing the roads? And I find it just amazing, kind of how few opportunities we as citizens have to really kind of make our opinion heard. And so I think we can, to a large extent pose these questions, and of course we have to educate each other and ourselves, but to a large extent we can also post these things to forums that, it doesn't have to be a formal referendum or a binding one, but to just get the idea of and the perceptions of as many people possible. I mean, for me it's always kind of, in technology, what can it do and what should it do? In
Mm.
the case of Elon Musk, I think he's about the last person to to kind of as the authority to raise ethical concerns, and you never know if he wants to stop to just make sure because he's behind on it to catch up, right? But sometimes I feel that technologies completely overestimate what the technology can do. So I'm for instance I'm like, artificial general intelligence. This is decades away, but that's my personal opinion, right? So I tend to kind of find that one less immediate than, for instance, climate change, where I see the things, already going on right now. But I think that different people have very different perspectives about what threats are the most important to our society right now, and very reasonable. And people have very different opinions about kind of which alternatives are actually feasible and should we do, right? And how costly they are to them. So there are some good ethical frameworks. There's some great ways to get informed, but I think we should, to a large extent, trust democracy, and trust it more than now, instead of just going and voting. Also, just have forums where we can regularly get the opinion of people without only having to listen to the loudest shouters that you sometimes have when you kind of do these kind of town halls and so forth.
Yeah. So I'm mindful of time because I know that we have a hard stop. But I have to say, this has been an amazing conversation. I am really super interested in the topic of decision making. Once I even wrote an article and share like how I make decisions as a product manager.
Oh, fantastic! I'd love to. Yeah,
Yeah, and therefore I really appreciate your time, and we'll leave all the resources and
yeah.
your books in the show notes, so a listener can check it out and deep dive more on the topic of decision making. And I love to do a round two at one point in the
Okay.
future.
Likewise, it was a pleasure talking with you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. And for listeners, I'll see you in the next episode. Bye. That's all from today's episode. Thank you so much for watching or listening. If you find this episode valuable, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or to the Polyweb podcast on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. It will be fantastic if you could leave us a rating, a review, or a comment, as this really helps other listeners find the show. All the resources mentioned in this episode will be linked in the description and in the show notes. See you on the next episode. And if you cannot wait until next week, you can watch this episode right here that relates to some of the things that we talk about in this episode. Bye.